The sun rose slowly over the mountain ridge, spreading a golden glow across the valley where the air was still and the only sound was the soft ripple of water kissing the rocks. The lake shimmered like a piece of glass surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed gently in the morning breeze. It was the kind of place that made people stop, breathe, and forget the noise of the world. For Ethan, this lake was not just water. It was memory, legacy, and life itself. His father had built the dam decades ago, back when the valley was wild and untouched. It was a small, simple structure made of old stone and steel, but it controlled everything: the flow of the river, the health of the fish, and the balance of the land. Ethan grew up here, learning how the lake worked, how to clean the filters, adjust the gates, and care for the land around it. When his father passed away, he didn't just leave him property. He left him responsibility. Ethan took that duty seriously. Every morning, he would walk the narrow trail to the dam, check the levers, and listen to the sound of the water rushing beneath. It was steady, peaceful, loyal. He often whispered to it like an old friend. "Keep steady," he would say softly, tapping the cold metal rail. And it always did. 4 years, he lived alone in the cabin by the lake, a quiet man who didn't need much. He had his land, his memories, and the silence he loved. But silence rarely lasts when greed finds its way to beauty. It started one spring morning when Ethan noticed a strange sign nailed to a tree near the entrance of his property. It was bright white with bold blue letters that read, "Future site of the Lakeside Vista Project. Luxury vacation cabins coming soon." For a few seconds, Ethan just stared at it, thinking it must be some mistake. He walked closer, reading the smaller print at the bottom, "Developed by Green Valley HOA." His chest tightened. "What in the world?" he muttered. He tore the sign down and looked around. The dirt road was quiet, no cars in sight, but something deep in his gut told him this was only the beginning. 2 days later, he woke to the sound of heavy engines. The noise was deep and angry, vibrating through the ground. When he stepped outside, his heart dropped. Bulldozers. 3 of them. They rolled down the slope, their blades scraping the earth, flattening wild grass that had grown untouched for decades. Behind them came trucks loaded with lumber and steel, and men in orange vests shouting directions. The once quiet valley was now filled with dust and noise. Ethan walked straight toward them, waving his arms. "Hey! You're on private property," he shouted. One of the workers looked confused but pointed toward a man standing near a black SUV. The man wore a pressed suit and sunglasses, looking completely out of place in the dirt and wind. Ethan marched toward him. "Who gave you permission to do this?" The man smiled as if he'd been expecting him. "Mr. Ethan Blake, right? I'm Richard Collins, president of the Green Valley HOA. We're starting construction for the new community project, Lakeside Vista. 7 to 9 cabins, walking trails, a clubhouse. It's going to be wonderful. You're building it here." Ethan's voice was sharp. "This is my land. This is my lake." Collins gave a short laugh, the kind that came from someone who believed he was untouchable. "The county records show this area as community property, Mr. Blake. The lake's technically part of the HOA boundaries now. We're just improving it for everyone's benefit." "That's not true," Ethan said firmly. "My father built this dam. The deeds are clear. You don't own this land." Collins smirked, taking off his sunglasses. "You might want to recheck that paperwork. Laws change, people change, ownership lines get blurry. Maybe you didn't pay your dues on time. Either way, we've already started the process." Ethan clenched his jaw, fury and disbelief burning inside him. "You're trespassing," he said. "Get your machines off my land." Collins leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "I suggest you relax, Mr. Blake. Fighting the HOA is expensive. It's easier to join the community than be the problem in it." Then he turned and walked back to his SUV, leaving Ethan standing in the dust. That night, Ethan sat at his old wooden desk, surrounded by papers, deeds, maps, letters from his father. He traced the boundary lines with his finger. The lake, the dam, the surrounding woods. They were all inside his property. The HOA had no claim. But as he looked out the window, he saw their lights still glowing across the shore. The bulldozers were parked, but the noise of the generators echoed through the night. They weren't leaving. The next morning, he found his private property signs ripped down and replaced with new ones that read Community Zone, authorized entry only. It felt like someone had stabbed his history in the heart. He went to the county office that week, only to find out the HOA had filed a temporary claim for land expansion under community improvement. It was supposed to be pending review, but somehow, they'd already started construction. They can't do that, Ethan told the clerk. It's illegal. The clerk sighed helplessly. Sir, they shouldn't have. But they're powerful. You'll need legal action, and that can take months. Months. By then, the lake would be gone. The following weeks were torture. Trees came down one after another, their trunks cracking like bones. Trucks poured concrete near the shore. Workers built cabins in straight rows, shining and perfect, destroying everything that made the place natural. Ethan tried talking to the workers, but most of them didn't even know they were on stolen land. They were just following orders. When he confronted Collins again, the man laughed. You're making a scene, he said. The community is thrilled about the cabins. You should be happy. It's going to raise property value. It's going to destroy the lake, Ethan replied. And when that happens, don't come running to me. The HOA can handle anything, Collins said confidently. We're professionals. Ethan didn't answer. He just walked away, but inside, something had shifted. His patience, the same patience that had kept him calm all these years, was running out. By late summer, the cabins stood finished, rows of shiny wood and glass reflecting on the surface of his stolen lake. They called it the Jewel of Green Valley. They put up banners, hosted parties, and advertised vacation packages online. Reporters came to take photos. People clapped and smiled, calling it progress. Ethan stood by the edge of the water, watching strangers swim in what used to be his family's sacred place. Children splashed near the shore where he once learned to fish with his father. It didn't feel like progress. It felt like theft. That night, he walked down the trail that led to the dam. The air was cool, the moon high, the forest whispering with wind. He carried a lantern, its light bouncing off the metal surface of the dam's control room. He hadn't been here in weeks, not since the noise started. He opened the old steel door, and the smell of oil and water hit him. Everything was still in perfect condition. The gauges gleamed softly in the light, the control lever standing firm and quiet, waiting. He stepped closer, brushing dust from the panel. His father's initials were still carved on the side, JB for James Blake. For a moment, Ethan felt like the old man was still standing beside him. You always said water remembers who it belongs to, Ethan whispered. Well, they've forgotten. He walked to the main valve and checked the readings. The pressure was steady, the reservoir full. Every drop of water behind that dam was his. It hit him then, not just the weight of loss, but the quiet truth that the HOA had made one mistake. They might have stolen his land on paper, but they couldn't touch the dam. It was built decades before the HOA existed. It ran under old water rights, registered separately, untouched by modern laws. His father had made sure of it. That dam wasn't just part of the lake. It was the lake. And Ethan controlled it completely. He stood there for a long time, staring at the slow movement of the gauge needles, listening to the hum of power in the pipes. Outside, the new cabins glowed like fireflies on the far shore, beautiful but fragile. You took what wasn't yours, he said softly, gripping the railing. But I still hold the key. The thought stayed with him all night. He couldn't sleep. He kept thinking of his father's words, of the way nature always took back what was stolen. As the sun began to rise again, painting the lake orange and gold, Ethan made up his mind. He didn't know when or how yet, but he would make them see. Not with anger, not with violence, but with the same element they tried to control. The water would speak for him. The next time they laughed at him, the next time Collins called him old-fashioned, they would remember what they had forgotten. The lake was alive, and it had an owner who never surrendered. Ethan walked out of the dam's control room, closing the door gently behind him. The sound of the lock echoed through the valley, deep and final, like a promise made to the land itself. The morning mist rose from the surface of the water, curling into the light like smoke, and as he looked across the lake one last time, a faint smile crossed his face. The calm man they thought was beaten was no longer watching from the shore. He was planning from the water days past, and the sound of saws, hammers, and engines became part of the valley's air, turning what was once a peaceful lake into a construction site of greed. Ethan woke every morning to the growl of machines echoing across the hills. The birds had stopped singing, the deer no longer came down to drink from the shore, and the water that once reflected the sky now rippled with oil and dirt. The HOA project had swallowed the lake completely. Every day new structures appeared, wooden cabins on steel frames, paved paths cutting through the woods, and docks being built right on the water's edge. The smell of fresh tar mixed with gasoline filled the air, killing the natural scent of pine and earth that Ethan had known his whole life. He tried to talk to the workers at first. "You can't build here," he told one of them, a young man unloading concrete bags. "This land's private." The worker shrugged. "Sir, talk to the HOA. They said it's theirs now. I'm just doing my job." Ethan sighed, realizing he wasn't fighting people. He was fighting a system. Every afternoon, a group of HOA board members arrived in shiny cars, walking around with clipboards, checking progress like kings inspecting their new empire. The president, Richard Collins, was always there, wearing his same smug smile, giving orders and pretending to care about the community. One day, Ethan saw them removing the old wooden sign his father had built decades ago. It read Blake Lake, private property. The letters were carved by hand, each stroke made by his father's knife. Without hesitation, they tore it down and replaced it with a glossy new sign that read Green Valley HOA, Community Access Area. Ethan's blood boiled. He walked toward them, fists clenched. "That's not your sign to take," he said sharply. Collins turned, acting amused. "Oh, Ethan. Still holding on to the past? It's time this place moved forward. The community deserves to enjoy the lake." "You mean profit from it?" Ethan replied. Collins smiled, unfazed. "Progress always looks like greed to people who hate change. Don't take it personally." He turned and walked away before Ethan could answer, his polished shoes crunching over the broken pieces of the old sign. Ethan stood there for a long time, his jaw tight, his heart pounding. That was the moment it hit him. They weren't just stealing his land. They were erasing his family. By the end of summer, the cabins were halfway done, and advertisements began popping up online. The HOA bragged about exclusive lakeside rentals, calling it a perfect mountain getaway. They used photos of his land, his water, his trees, as if they had built paradise from nothing. Ethan printed one of the ads and pinned it to his wall. The tagline read, "Wake up to the sound of nature. Lakeside Vista Cabins, now open for pre-booking." He stared at it for a while before saying quietly, "Wake up to the sound of bulldozers, more like it." He started keeping a logbook of everything happening, the dates, the noise, the water tests, the damages. Every time a pipe was laid or a tree was cut, he wrote it down. Every photo he took went into a folder. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was preparing. One afternoon, Ethan noticed something strange. The small stream that fed the lower end of his land had been rerouted. He followed it through the woods, only to find workers laying plastic pipes into the main waterline that came from the dam. "Hey!" he shouted. The workers froze. "Who told you to mess with that line?" "The HOA," one replied nervously. "We're diverting flow to fill the new lagoon near the cabins." Ethan's face turned pale. "That line regulates the lake's level. You mess with that, you'll flood the banks or drain the whole thing." The man hesitated. "We just follow orders." Ethan stormed down to the HOA trailer set up near the construction site. Collins was inside, talking to someone on the phone. Ethan didn't wait for him to finish. "You're rerouting my water lines," he said. "You'll ruin the lake's balance." Collins raised an eyebrow, annoyed. We're creating a lagoon, Ethan. It's for aesthetics. It's for disaster, Ethan snapped. That flow keeps the dam pressure safe. You can't just redirect it. Collins leaned back in his chair, smiling like a man who loved watching others lose their temper. I can, actually. The HOA now maintains this entire area. If you have concerns, you can file them in writing. You think this paper ownership means control? Ethan said, stepping closer. You don't understand what you're touching. And you don't understand progress, Collins replied coldly. We're building something beautiful here. Maybe when it's finished, we'll name one of the cabins after you, the old man's cabin. The room erupted in laughter from the other board members. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, his voice dropping low. You're playing with something bigger than paperwork, Collins. Water doesn't take orders. Then maybe it'll listen to mine, Collins smirked. Ethan left without another word. He drove straight to the dam that evening, his headlights cutting through the mist. When he arrived, the sound of the rushing water felt louder, almost angry, as if it could sense what was coming. He walked along the concrete path, running his fingers along the cold metal railing. The gauges still held steady, but he noticed the inflow readings had dropped slightly. The diverted pipe was already reducing the pressure, just as he feared. The HOA didn't understand how delicate this system was. His father used to say the dam was alive. It breathed, it remembered, it punished those who didn't respect it. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring into the dark water below, thinking. He couldn't fight them with words. The county wouldn't listen. The HOA had power, money, lawyers. But they didn't have what he had, the understanding of this land. He knew every rock, every root, every sound the dam made when it shifted with the current. He whispered softly into the air. You've been patient, my friend. Maybe it's time they learned what you can do. The next morning, Ethan began preparing quietly. He checked the dam's internal systems daily, making small adjustments, making sure it was strong, ready. He started replacing bolts, cleaning filters, and tightening levers that hadn't moved in years. The HOA thought he was just some old man wandering around the lake. They didn't know he was inspecting the weapon they had built their greed upon. Over the next week, Ethan watched as the cabins neared completion. Fancy docks stretched over the water. Lights flickered across the surface at night like a false promise of peace. But there were signs of arrogance everywhere. Drainage pipes leaking, debris floating, and the water level slowly rising from their poor management. Nature was already pushing back. Then one afternoon, while Ethan was checking his fence, he saw something that made him stop. 2 HOA trucks were dumping gravel and soil directly near the lake's edge, building a fake beach area. The dirt slid into the water, clouding it with brown mud. Fish surfaced, gasping, and ducks flew away in panic. Ethan's jaw tightened. He walked closer, shouting over the engines. Stop dumping. You're choking the lake. One of the foremen looked down from the truck and yelled back, Orders from Mr. Collins. Tell him he's killing the water. Ethan shouted. The man shrugged. He says it'll settle. Ethan stood there helplessly as the trucks continued. The brown water spread further, thick and lifeless. When the engines finally stopped, the damage was done. That night, Ethan sat by his cabin fire, staring at the flickering flames. His logbook sat open beside him, filled with notes, photos, and drawings of the dam. On the last page, he wrote one line, When they take from the water will take back. Outside, the lake was still, reflecting the moon like a mirror. But beneath that calm surface, the dam's pressure readings had already started changing. Small adjustments Ethan made earlier were now causing the water to flow differently, subtly altering the balance. He wasn't planning destruction. He was letting the system teach them what they refused to learn. By the next morning, rumors spread through the construction crew. They said the water looked higher, the current stronger. Collins dismissed it all, saying, It's fine, the dam's old, it always looks like that. But Ethan knew better. The dam was reacting, remembering. It was alive, just as his father had said. That night, Ethan walked down the trail again, the lantern in his hand flickering as he reached the dam's control room. He opened the door slowly and looked at the gauges glowing in the dim light. The pressure was rising exactly as he wanted, not dangerously, just enough to make the lake reclaim what was stolen. He touched the lever gently, his reflection faint in the control glass. "They built cabins on your back," he said softly. "But you and I both know, they built them too low." Outside, thunder rumbled far in the distance. The first signs of an early autumn storm. Ethan looked up at the clouds rolling over the mountains and smiled faintly. Let's see if they can handle the water they wanted so badly. Then he locked the control room door and walked away, his shadow fading into the mist, leaving the dam humming quietly behind him like a sleeping giant waiting to wake. Autumn arrived early that year, and with it came banners, bright lights, and the kind of arrogance that only people blind to consequences could carry. The lake, once peaceful and quiet, was now dressed in colors that didn't belong to it. Glittering decorations, floating lanterns, and shining signs that read "Welcome to Lakeside Vista, a dream by Green Valley HOA. Ethan watched from the top of the hill, his hands resting on the wooden fence, as guests arrived in polished cars, their headlights slicing through the evening fog. The once dirt road had been widened and paved, cutting straight through his family's old grove. The smell of gasoline and perfume replaced the natural scent of pine. People in suits and dresses walked along the new docks, laughing and taking selfies, unaware that they were standing on stolen ground. A stage had been built near the shore where the HOA president, Richard Collins, stood in his sharp gray suit, holding a microphone. He smiled wide for the cameras, his voice echoing across the valley. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Green Valley's proudest achievement. 7 to 9 cabins built with care, surrounded by the most beautiful lake in the state." Applause filled the air, loud and hollow, like thunder with no rain. Ethan stayed quiet, his face unreadable, but his heart was heavy. He could still see the faint reflection of the old world in that lake, the place his father once said was alive with memory. Now, that memory was buried under concrete and ego. The crowd cheered again as Collins gestured toward the water. "And to make this night special, we'll have fireworks over the lake, our gift to the community." Music started playing, and people clapped as colored lights flickered in the sky. But in the distance, near the dam, the water was no longer calm. Ethan noticed the faint ripples spreading wider than usual, moving with a rhythm that didn't match the wind. He could feel it in his bones. The pressure was building. The dam was speaking to him, humming with quiet energy beneath the surface. He looked down at the crowd again, at their champagne glasses and empty smiles, and whispered, "Enjoy it while it lasts." The fireworks burst above, painting the night with color. Red, gold, and blue lights reflected on the water, but behind the beauty, Ethan saw something darker, the cracks forming beneath the surface of their illusion. The lake looked calm, but he knew better. It was holding its anger like a sleeping beast, waiting for the right moment. The next morning, the newspapers called it a perfect celebration. Photos of Collins shaking hands with investors filled the front pages. Reporters praised the HOA for bringing prosperity to Green Valley. They didn't mention the man standing alone in the background of one photo, Ethan, his face half hidden, watching quietly. While the world praised Collins, Ethan went back to the dam. He unlocked the small control room and stepped inside. The air was cool, the sound of water rushing below louder than usual. The gauges blinked softly in the dim light. The reservoir was near capacity, higher than it should have been this time of year. He ran his fingers along the pressure readings and nodded. It was holding steady but strong. Strong enough to remind anyone who tested it that nature never truly loses ownership. He looked around at the old photos pinned on the wall, black and white pictures of his father building the dam, smiling proudly beside it. Under one photo, there was a faded note his father once wrote, "Respect the water, or it will take back what's owed." Ethan touched the paper gently and whispered, "You were right, Dad. They don't respect it. They think they own it." Outside, the wind carried faint sounds of laughter from the other side of the lake. Collins and his team were already celebrating early success. Bookings were full, guests were arriving, and money was flowing in. They thought they had won. But Ethan wasn't done. That evening, he drove into town quietly, buying new locks, tools, and waterproof lights. He also stopped by the county archive office and requested a copy of the original dam registration papers, proof that the structure, its mechanisms, and the surrounding area fell entirely under his jurisdiction. The young clerk gave him a puzzled look as she handed over the documents. "You're the last registered owner of this dam, Mr. Blake. It's been in your family for over 70 years. Ethan smiled faintly. "And it's going to stay that way." That night, when he returned to the lake, the cabins glowed beautifully under the moonlight, their reflections dancing across the surface. From a distance, it looked like paradise, but Ethan knew better. Every reflection hid the truth beneath. He parked near the dam and walked up the narrow metal stairs, the sound of his boots echoing softly. When he reached the top, he looked out at the vast water spread before him. The lights from the cabins shimmered on the surface like a crown of gold, but beneath that crown, the water was rising. Ethan rested his hands on the cold steel railing and took a slow breath. "They think they built this place," he murmured. "But everything here still runs through this gate." He checked the gears and levers again, adjusting a few of the older bolts, cleaning off rust, and making sure every part worked perfectly. The dam was old, but it was loyal. It had protected his family's land for generations, and now it would protect its honor. The next morning, the HOA meeting took place at the new community hall overlooking the lake. Collins stood before his board, proud and loud. "We've already sold 50 of the cabins," he said. "The rest are being rented for winter packages. The community fund has never been this full." A younger board member raised his hand. "Some of the engineers said the water level looks unusually high near the south dock. Should we check it?" Collins waved him off. "It's just seasonal rain. Don't worry about it." But worry had already started spreading. A few locals had begun to notice cracks forming in the newly built pathways near the shoreline. Small leaks appeared in some cabin basements. Instead of investigating, Collins blamed the contractors. "They used cheap materials," he said. "Nothing serious." Ethan heard all of this through neighbors who still respected him. They came quietly to his cabin, warning him that the HOA was ignoring safety. One older man said, "They don't care about the lake, Ethan. They care about their pockets." Ethan nodded. "I know. But soon, the lake will remind them who's in charge." That evening, he went back to the dam once more. The sun was setting behind the mountains, turning the sky red. The water shimmered dark and heavy, the air thick with moisture. He stood at the edge, feeling the cool mist on his face, the roar of the current beneath his feet. For a long time, he said nothing, just listened. Then he whispered softly, "They've filled it too far, too fast. The balance is gone." He walked back to the control house, locking the door behind him. As the first stars appeared in the sky, he turned the small pressure valve a single notch tighter, letting the buildup continue just a little more. It wasn't enough to break, just enough to remind the lake that it could. The faint sound of gears moving echoed through the valley like a heartbeat. Across the lake, the cabins stood still, their windows glowing warm in the night. Inside, people slept soundly, unaware that their comfort rested on the patience of the water below. Ethan stepped outside, the cold air brushing against his face. He looked out over the lake one last time before heading home. "You took everything from me," he said quietly. "But you forgot, I hold the flood." Then he walked back down the trail, his shadow long under the moonlight, as the dam behind him hummed softly, waiting, alive, and loyal. The calm days that followed the grand opening were only calm on the surface. Beneath the shining water, beneath the laughter of vacationers, the lake had begun to change. Ethan could see it, feel it, hear it in the tone of the rushing water under the dam. The sound was heavier now, deeper, like a heartbeat slowing before a storm. To the visitors, it was just another quiet mountain morning, but to Ethan, it was the whisper of something coming. The pressure was building. The HOA continued to expand its dream. More cabins opened every week, and people came from nearby towns to enjoy what the brochures called the perfect lake getaway. They didn't know the water they swam in was no longer calm, no longer friendly. Ethan stood at his window every evening, watching the reflection of those cabins glitter across the surface like false stars. He could almost hear his father's voice again, that calm tone that always carried a warning: the water doesn't forgive arrogance. It was true then, and it was true now. The HOA board, drunk with success, ignored every warning sign. Small cracks had started forming near the south dock. The maintenance team reported unusual moisture under the walkways. Instead of investigating, Richard Collins laughed it off in meetings. "It's nothing," he told them. "Just the lake settling around the new foundations. It'll stabilize." But the truth was, the lake wasn't settling, it was waking up. Ethan's quiet adjustments at the dam had slowly begun taking effect. Every night he would go there, tightening one bolt, adjusting one valve, controlling the flow to raise the water bit by bit. It wasn't fast enough for anyone to notice right away, but the difference was constant, unrelenting. Inch by inch, the lake began to push back against the new borders forced upon it. One morning, a construction worker came knocking at Collins's door, holding a photo of the shoreline. "Sir, the water level's higher than it should be. We're losing soil from the lower edges." Collins barely looked up from his coffee. "Then build a retaining wall. I don't want to hear about water problems again." "But sir, do I pay you to question me or fix it?" The man went silent and walked away, shaking his head. That afternoon, Ethan stood on the hill overlooking the lake and saw the workers hauling in concrete blocks to fortify the shore. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. "You can't cage water," he murmured. "It always finds a way." Over the next week, heavy rain began to fall across the valley. The storm season had arrived early, drenching the hills in constant showers. The cabins' roofs dripped non-stop, the drains overflowed, and the lake, already high, began to swell faster. The HOA members panicked and sent out an emergency crew to inspect the dam. They weren't allowed inside, of course. The lock Ethan had installed was solid, and the county still recognized him as the only authorized keeper. Collins was furious when he heard this. "He's blocking access to community property," he shouted during a meeting. "We can't risk flooding." "But Mr. Collins," one board member said nervously, "the paperwork says the dam is privately owned. It's under Ethan Blake's control." "Then he's controlling too much water," Collins snapped. "We'll get the county to intervene." But the county didn't move as fast as his temper. Bureaucracy took time, and Ethan knew that. For now, the power of the lake remained his alone. That evening, he walked down to the dam again under heavy rain, his coat soaked through, boots splashing in the mud. The lantern light cut through the mist as he opened the metal door and stepped inside the control room. The air smelled of rust and rain. The gauges glowed softly in the dimness, their needles trembling under the growing weight of the water. The reservoir reading was higher than ever before. Ethan placed his hand on the main lever, feeling the vibration of the lake pulsing through the steel. "Steady," he whispered, "not yet." The sound of thunder echoed across the valley. For a moment, lightning illuminated the lake outside, and he saw how wide it had grown. The cabins that once stood far from the shore now looked dangerously close to the rising edge. He knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA realized the truth. They had built too low. When Ethan returned home that night, he found a letter shoved under his door. It was from the HOA. The paper was soggy from rain, the ink smudged, but he could still read it clearly. "Effective immediately, you are required to surrender dam access to the Green Valley HOA for maintenance and regulation purposes." Ethan laughed under his breath. They finally noticed. He folded the letter neatly and placed it on the table beside his father's old photograph. "They can have access," he said softly, "when they learn what respect means." The next morning, he drove into town to buy supplies: food, batteries, tools, and a few things most wouldn't think twice about. The shopkeeper, an old friend named Ray, looked concerned. "You expecting a bad storm?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Something like that." "Be careful, Ethan," Ray said. The radio says the valley might flood if the rain keeps up. I know, Ethan said calmly. The valley always remembers its shape. When he got back to the lake, the rain was relentless. The water now lapped against the first line of cabins. Collins ordered more sandbags and hired extra workers to reinforce the dock. He even tried calling Ethan, but the call went unanswered. At this point, Ethan didn't need to argue. He just needed to wait. That night, he sat on the dam once more, the storm whipping his coat against the railings. The waves below crashed violently, slapping the concrete walls as if demanding to be freed. The dam groaned faintly, not in weakness but in warning. Ethan spoke quietly into the rain. They mocked your strength, old friend. Show them your truth when the time comes. In the cabins across the lake, lights flickered as the power wavered. Guests peeked through windows, uneasy about the roaring wind and the water that had crept closer to their porches. Inside one of the cabins, a woman screamed when she saw her dock lift off its foundation and float away. By midnight, the HOA's emergency meeting was in full chaos. Collins paced the floor, his phone pressed to his ear. Get me the county engineer. I don't care if it's midnight. Sir, one of the board members said, the engineer said they can't do anything until the storm passes. Then stop the storm. Collins yelled, slamming his fist on the table. Outside, the water was already spilling over the lowest retaining wall. The drainage channels were clogged with mud and debris. The workers they had hired were overwhelmed, fighting a losing battle against nature. Meanwhile, Ethan stood by the dam's gate, lantern in hand, completely still. The wind tore through his hair, the rain poured down his face, but he didn't move. He watched the gauges carefully as the red line crossed into the danger zone. It was time. He took a slow breath and spoke into the storm. Let them feel what they built on. Then, with one calm motion, he turned the small side valve 2 notches tighter, redirecting more pressure into the lake's upper basin. It wouldn't break the dam, not yet, but it would push the water to its limits. Enough to make them understand they were never in control. The ground trembled slightly beneath his feet. The water roared louder, echoing through the valley like a voice long silenced. Lightning struck again, and in that blinding flash, Ethan saw the truth of it all. The cabins, the lights, the greed. They were nothing compared to the force of nature behind him. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, the water remembers. As the thunder rolled and the rain fell harder, Ethan turned away and locked the control room once more. The dam stood behind him like a sleeping beast, its roar rising through the storm. Across the lake, chaos began to bloom as the first cabins flooded, the walkways submerged. And the HOA's empire started to crumble under the very water they had claimed. The pressure had built long enough, and now, nothing could hold it back. The storm arrived like a beast crawling out of the mountains, slow at first, then all at once. By nightfall, the valley was covered in darkness so thick even the lake lost its reflection. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches until they cracked, and the rain came down in heavy sheets that blurred everything beyond a few feet. The cabins that once glowed with comfort now trembled under the assault of the weather. The water, once gentle, now churned violently against the new docks and walls the HOA had built to control it. But there was no control anymore. Nature had decided it was time to speak. Ethan stood at his window, watching lightning flash across the sky, lighting up the lake for a brief second before plunging it back into blackness. Each flash showed more chaos. The waterline had reached the steps of the first row of cabins. He could see headlights moving on the far side of the lake, HOA trucks rushing through the mud, men shouting orders lost in the wind. The storm had no mercy, and the water had no patience left. Ethan grabbed his raincoat, lantern, and keys. He knew what needed to be done. He walked outside, the wind nearly knocking him back. The air was cold and electric, filled with the sound of thunder rolling over the valley. He climbed into his old truck and drove slowly toward the dam road, his headlights slicing through the fog and rain. Every turn of the wheels splashed through deep puddles. Every flash of lightning showed trees bending dangerously close to falling. When he reached the dam, he stopped the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the roar of the lake behind the walls. It wasn't just noise. It was anger, deep and old. He opened the door and stepped out into the storm, the rain instantly soaking him through. The metal walkway leading to the control room was slippery and shaking under the wind. He moved carefully, gripping the rail, his lantern flickering wildly in his hand. As he reached the door, a blast of wind blew it open with a metallic groan, and he stepped inside, shutting it behind him. The sound of the storm outside faded slightly, replaced by the low, endless rumble of water rushing below. The gauges on the wall glowed faintly in the dim light, their needles trembling violently. The red one, pressure level, was higher than ever before, nearly at the top of the dial. Ethan stared at it for a long moment. "You've held strong, old friend," he whispered. "But it's time." He walked over to the main lever, the one that had stayed untouched for years. It was large and rusted at the edges, but solid. The engraved initials of his father, J.B., still shone faintly through the years of wear. Lightning flashed outside, and in that split second, Ethan could see his own reflection in the metal surface. Calm eyes, wet hair, and a face that carried both sorrow and resolve. He remembered the first time his father had shown him how to open the dam, how to balance the flow, how to respect the force behind the gate. "Never do it out of anger, son," his father had said. "Do it only when you must remind people that nature doesn't serve anyone." And tonight, he wasn't acting out of anger. He was reminding them. He wrapped both hands around the lever, his muscles tense from the cold. The sound of thunder cracked above him as if the sky itself was waiting. Then, with one deep breath, he pulled. The metal groaned, the gears screamed, and the ground beneath him shook as the gate began to open. At first, only a small roar came from below, like a warning growl. Then the pressure broke free. A wall of water thundered out from the dam's base, rushing down the channel like a living creature unleashed. The whole structure trembled as the released flood tore through the narrow pass, heading straight toward the valley below. Ethan stood there, gripping the lever as the vibration shook his bones, watching through the small window as the water exploded into the night. The sound was deafening, drowning out even the thunder. It was as if the earth itself was shouting back after being silenced too long. Across the lake, chaos erupted. The HOA's precious vacation cabins, built too close to the shore, were hit first. Water rushed through their foundations, splintering wood, flipping decks, and swallowing docks. Lights went out one by one, replaced by flashes of lightning reflecting on rising waves. Guests screamed and ran, their shouts lost in the storm. Cars tried to escape the narrow roads, only to get stuck in mud that turned into rivers. Collins stood outside the main hall, soaked and terrified, watching his dream crumble. "Get the pumps running," he shouted. But the pumps were useless, small machines against the force of a dam's fury. His assistant ran up, yelling over the storm. "It's the dam. It's releasing water." "That's impossible," Collins yelled back. "It can't open on its own." But deep inside, he knew exactly who could open it. His face turned pale as he whispered, "Blake." The water surged higher, dragging furniture, boats, and fences into its current. The cabins nearest the edge collapsed one after another, their wooden walls breaking apart under the unstoppable flood. The lights of the entire lower valley went dark as power lines fell into the water. Collins stumbled back, watching everything he had built vanish before his eyes. Meanwhile, on the dam, Ethan stood still, rain pouring down his face, the lantern swinging wildly beside him. He wasn't smiling. There was no joy in this, only justice. He watched the water pour out, fierce and endless, reclaiming what was stolen. He knew the flood wouldn't destroy everything. The dam wouldn't let it. But it would destroy their arrogance, their empire of lies. For the first time, they would understand the meaning of boundaries. He turned the lever slightly back, just enough to control the flow and keep the dam stable. The roar continued, loud and powerful, echoing through the valley like a song of vengeance. When the storm reached its peak, lightning struck the top of the lake, lighting up the entire valley in blinding white. For a second, Ethan saw everything. The cabins half submerged, cars floating, trees bending, and in the distance, Collins standing in knee-deep water, looking helpless. The sight was both terrifying and satisfying. Ethan whispered, "Now you understand." The wind howled through the dam's steel beams, and the rain poured harder. He stood there until his hands grew numb, making sure the structure held steady. When he was certain the water had done its work, he slowly pushed the lever back to half-closed position. The roar softened slightly, the vibration eased. The flood would still rage through the night, but it would stop short of full destruction. Nature had punished enough. By dawn, the storm began to fade. The thunder moved farther away, leaving behind a valley drowning in silence and ruin. The sky turned gray, the rain slowing to a soft drizzle. Ethan stood outside, looking at the aftermath. The lake had changed shape, wider now, deeper, stronger. The cabins lay scattered in pieces across the muddy banks. The docks were gone, the signs torn, the banners floating uselessly in the water. And through all of it, the dam stood tall, solid, untouched. He looked down the valley and saw flashing lights, emergency vehicles crawling through the wreckage. People were shouting, wading through water, trying to save what little was left. Somewhere among them was Collins, shouting orders that no one listened to anymore. Ethan turned away from the scene and looked up at the rising sun breaking through the clouds. The light hit the water's surface, turning it gold. For the first time in months, the lake looked beautiful again. Not perfect, not peaceful, but real. It was alive. He took a deep breath, tasting the cold air, and said softly, "It's done." Then he walked back along the wet trail, his boots sinking in the mud, his shadow long behind him. The dam hummed quietly as he left, its work complete, its secret safe once more. Morning came slowly over the broken valley, the gray sky heavy with leftover clouds, and the air smelled of wet earth and splintered wood. The lake had changed. Where there used to be calm water and shining cabins, now there was silence, smoke, and ruin. The flood had taken everything the HOA had built with pride and greed. The once perfect cabins lay half submerged, tilted at odd angles, their roofs broken, their walls soaked and sagging. Docks floated aimlessly, fences were gone, and the roads leading into the property had turned into rivers of mud. The sound of crying and shouting echoed through the mist as rescue teams arrived, their red lights cutting through the fog like bleeding stars. Ethan stood on the hill above it all, hands resting on the fence, watching the scene below with a quiet expression. He didn't smile. There was nothing to smile about. What happened wasn't joy. It was balance returning to the land. He watched as people waded through knee-deep water, carrying bags, boxes, and whatever pieces of their luxury they could still save. Cars sat half-buried in mud, their alarms beeping weakly in the distance. The proud Lakeside Vista sign had snapped in half and floated upside down near the shore. It was as if the lake itself had spat it out in disgust. In the center of the chaos stood Richard Collins, soaked, covered in mud, his suit ruined, his face pale with exhaustion. He barked orders to whoever would listen, but no one was listening anymore. His voice cracked as he yelled for the pumps, for engineers, for anyone who could tell him how this had happened. But deep down, he already knew. Every few minutes, he glanced across the lake toward the old dam, standing tall and unbroken, and his jaw tightened. He could see Ethan's small cabin faintly in the distance, smoke rising gently from its chimney, untouched by the storm. "It's his fault," Collins muttered. "He did this." One of the board members turned toward him, trembling. "Richard, the county's already sending investigators. They're saying the dam was opened intentionally." Collins froze, his heart pounding. "Then they'll blame him," he said quickly. "He owns it. It's his responsibility." The man looked away. "But the reports, they show your team diverted the water flow without permission. They found your construction plans." Collins's face went blank. "What?" "They said the pressure built up because of the lagoon project. You rerouted the main line to make that fake beach. It weakened the drainage." Collins grabbed the man by the collar. "You shut your mouth," he hissed. "This isn't my fault." But even as he said it, he could hear his own voice shaking. He looked around. Reporters were arriving now, cameras flashing through the wreckage, filming the broken cabins, the soaked guests, the angry homeowners shouting for refunds. The once celebrated project had turned into a public disaster overnight. HOA negligence destroys vacation cabins, read one headline later that day. Green Valley's luxury lake turns into nightmare, said another. On the news, Ethan's name was mentioned briefly, local property owner of the historic dam, not involved in HOA development. He stayed out of interviews, refusing to speak publicly. He didn't need to. The truth was speaking loudly enough. That evening, as the sun began to fall behind the soaked hills, Ethan walked down toward the edge of the lake. The water was calm again, quiet after its rage. The mud sucked at his boots as he stepped closer to what used to be the main dock. Broken wood floated past him, along with pieces of furniture, signs, and shingles. The water shimmered with faint traces of oil and dirt, but beneath the surface, he could see life returning. Fish swimming slowly, reeds starting to rise again. The lake had survived. It had purged itself. As he stood there, he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, he saw Collins walking through the mud, his once slick hair plastered to his forehead, his hands shaking. His eyes burned with frustration and desperation. "You think this is funny, Blake?" he shouted. "You think you've won?" Ethan stayed quiet. "You destroyed everything," Collins yelled. "You flooded it. You ruined people's lives." Ethan looked at him calmly. "No, Richard," he said softly. "You did. You could have stopped it," Collins said, stepping closer. "You could have closed that dam." "And you could have listened," Ethan replied. "You ignored every warning, every sign. You took the lake, cut its veins, and then called it progress." Collins's breathing quickened. "You're finished," he said. "I'll sue you. I'll make sure they take that dam away from you." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "You can't take what was never yours." The wind blew softly through the broken trees as they stood there facing each other, one calm, the other trembling. In the distance, the flashing lights of emergency trucks painted the valley red and blue. Collins's voice cracked as he whispered, "They're saying you opened it." Ethan looked out at the lake and said, "The dam has rules. It releases when the pressure becomes too much. Maybe it finally had enough of being used." Collins stared at him for a moment, unable to tell if Ethan was being literal or not. "You can't hide behind nature," he said bitterly. Ethan turned to him. "I'm not hiding. I'm part of it." Collins clenched his fists, but before he could say another word, a sheriff's truck pulled up behind them. Sheriff Daniels stepped out, his hat dripping with rain, his expression firm. "Gentlemen," he said, "we've got reports to file. Mr. Collins, the investigators want to speak to you." "About what?" Collins asked, trying to sound calm. "About the construction permits," the sheriff said, "and the fact that your team altered a water system without county approval. You'll need to come with me." Collins's face went white. "That's ridiculous," he shouted. "This man, he's responsible." He pointed at Ethan, but the sheriff shook his head. "Mr. Blake's dam is intact and within legal operation. It's not the dam's fault the water had nowhere else to go." Collins froze, speechless. "You can come quietly," the sheriff added, "or I can call for backup." Collins looked around. The news cameras were still rolling, capturing everything. His empire, his pride, his reputation. It was all gone. He lowered his head and followed the sheriff without another word. Ethan watched them leave, the sound of mud squelching under their boots fading into the distance. The storm had washed everything away, including arrogance. As night fell, the valley was silent again, except for the gentle sound of water lapping against the shore. Ethan walked along the edge, his boots sinking slightly with every step. The moonlight broke through the clouds, reflecting on the calm surface of the lake. He stopped for a moment, looking out at the dam in the distance, strong and unmoved. "You did well," he whispered. "You reminded them who you belong to." He stood there for a while, listening to the quiet hum of nature returning to order. In the far distance, frogs began croaking again, birds chirped softly from the trees, and a faint breeze carried the smell of wet pine across the valley. The land was healing. Ethan turned and walked back up the hill toward his cabin. When he reached his porch, he stopped and looked back one last time. The lights from the wrecked cabins flickered faintly like dying embers, and the reflection of the moon stretched across the water like a silver scar. He knew this wasn't just an ending, it was a reminder. Greed could build walls and fences, but nature would always find a way to break them. He went inside, hung up his wet coat, and sat by the fire. The flames danced gently, warm and quiet. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned back in his chair, the sound of rain still faint on the roof. The world outside was finally still again. The lake, the dam, the valley, they were his again, not by ownership on paper, but by respect earned through patience and truth. He whispered softly, almost to himself, balance restored. Then he closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the sound of the quiet lake fill the room. As the night embraced the valley that had finally found peace again. Weeks passed since the storm that had washed away arrogance from the valley. The broken cabins were gone now, hauled away in pieces by cleanup crews. What remained was silence and the sound of gentle water moving against the rocks, as if the lake was breathing again after holding its breath for too long. The HOA that once ruled the area with pride had collapsed under its own weight. Lawsuits piled up, investors vanished, and every homeowner who once admired Richard Collins now turned against him. The county confirmed what everyone suspected. The flood wasn't an accident. The diverted water lines, the illegal lagoon, and the negligence of the HOA had caused everything. The papers called it the Green Valley Collapse. Ethan read the headlines once, then folded the newspaper and never looked at it again. He didn't need their stories. He had his own truth, written in the calm ripples of his lake. The sheriff visited him a few times, mostly to check in or ask a few questions for official reports. You did what you had to, Sheriff Daniels said during one visit, standing by the fence overlooking the lake. You warned them plenty of times. Ethan nodded quietly. I didn't want it to come to this, he said softly. But they left me no choice. The sheriff sighed, tipping his hat. Funny thing about people, Ethan. They think power means control. But real power's knowing when to let go. Ethan smiled faintly. The lake knew before I did. The sheriff chuckled, then turned to leave. Well, you take care of this place. It listens to you. That's rare. It listens because I listen to it, Ethan replied. After that, the sheriff drove away, and silence returned once more. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, life came back to the valley. Birds nested in the trees again, fish returned to the deeper waters, and wildflowers grew where tire marks once scarred the soil. Ethan worked every morning, repairing the fences, clearing fallen branches, and checking the dam. The structure stood strong, untouched by the storm, its stone surface glistening under the sunlight. It had held its promise, it had punished, but not destroyed. It was as if even the water itself knew the difference between justice and revenge. One afternoon, while Ethan was tightening a bolt near the dam, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned and saw someone he never expected to see again, Richard Collins. But this wasn't the same man who had laughed in meetings and boasted to cameras. This was someone broken. His expensive suit was replaced with simple clothes, his face pale, his hair graying at the edges. He carried a small envelope in his hand, and his eyes looked tired, empty. Ethan didn't move. You're not supposed to be here, he said quietly. Collins nodded slowly. I know. I just needed to see it. He looked at the dam, then the lake stretching wide and peaceful before them. It's beautiful, he said softly. Even after everything. Ethan kept his gaze steady. It was beautiful before you touched it. Collins nodded again, guilt flickering in his eyes. I deserved that, he said. You were right about everything. I thought I could shape this place into something better, but I was just shaping my own downfall. Ethan didn't respond. He waited, letting the silence do the talking. Collins finally opened the envelope and took out a folded piece of paper. The HOA is gone. The county dissolved it last week. I signed the final documents. He handed the paper to Ethan. This restores full control of the lake and surrounding land to you. It's officially yours again. No one can claim it now. Ethan took the paper, reading it briefly, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. You didn't need to bring it in person, he said. I know, Collins replied. But I wanted to. You should hear it from me. For a long time, they both stood there, staring at the water. The wind moved gently across the surface, carrying the faint reflection of clouds overhead. Collins spoke again, his voice lower. You know, when the flood hit, I thought it was the end of everything. But after I saw the aftermath, after I saw how the lake stood, calm and alive, I realized it wasn't destruction. It was correction. Nature has a way of teaching lessons that no man can ignore. You learned late, Ethan said quietly. But you learned. Collins nodded. Yes, I did. And I'll spend the rest of my life remembering it. He looked out over the dam one last time, then turned to leave. Take care of it, Ethan. It deserves someone who understands it. I always have, Ethan replied. Collins gave a faint smile, then walked away slowly, his figure fading into the mist. When he was gone, Ethan turned back to the lake. The sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the surface. The water sparkled gently, peaceful and free again. He placed his hand on the cool metal of the railing and whispered, They finally know, Dad. They finally understand. The wind carried his words across the valley, echoing softly through the trees. That evening, as the sun set, Ethan sat on his porch with a cup of tea in his hand, his dog lying quietly beside him. The air was cool, the world silent except for the gentle sound of water flowing through the dam. He watched the horizon glow orange and pink, the sky reflecting perfectly in the calm lake below. It looked like a painting, one his father would have loved. He thought about everything that had happened, the warnings, the arrogance, the flood, the silence that followed, and realized that every piece of it had led to this moment. Peace, not victory. Balance, not revenge. He had his land back, but more importantly, he had restored respect to it. As darkness slowly covered the valley, the stars appeared one by one, their reflections dancing on the water. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy with calm. He whispered softly, The water always remembers who it belongs to. The night grew quiet, the dam humming in rhythm with the lake's gentle pulse, the valley breathing once more in harmony. Somewhere in the distance, the faint cry of an owl echoed, and the world felt whole again. Ethan closed his eyes, and the story ended where it began, with the lake, calm and eternal, holding its secret under the starlight, watched over by the man who never forgot that nature never truly loses, only waits for its turn to be heard.